Okay, so we are going to talk rugby now because obviously the Connacht job has come up in the last 24 hours, and the Ulster coach situation is a little bit clearer, although we're still not quite sure when McFarlane is going to actually arrive. But in terms of the available names for this, Dave, why would Connacht not be trying to convince the IRFU to pay for Ronan O'Gara or somebody of that ilk to come? Why do they have to go fishing around for names in the Southern Hemisphere that we don't know and who don't fully understand the culture?
Well, they don't have to do that. They will be going for the guy that they think. Well, if you're sitting in that kind of boardroom, you're coming up with a short list, and I assume you're starting at the very top, and then you're trying to mirror that and match that to the income available, the revenues available to actually pay for this guy, whoever it might be. So if you're thinking of the best possible guys to take this job, certainly Ronan O'Gara would be on the list, wouldn't it? Like, if you're looking to give it to an assistant coach who's on an upward trajectory and has what you would appear to have a really bright future out of him. Now, whether or not you can afford that, that's where the RFU come in. I don't think Kieran Keane would have been on as much as Pat Lam would have been, for example, certainly in his last year or two.
And you would assume that somebody like Ronan O'Gara is going to bring massive corporate support. Like, suddenly everybody wants to see what's happening there because O'Gara is in charge.
It would work wonders on and off the field, no question about it. We talked about this last week when we were discussing the vacancy that's now at Ulster. Well, it was a vacancy when we talked about it last week, and now seems to have been filled by McFarlane. But that it was the worst possible time, we put this to Stephen Ferris, to be looking for a new head coach in the April before a World Cup year, because nobody's really going to want to make their move until after the World Cup. All the top international head coaches, they're obviously firmly ensconced until the World Cup is done in Japan, and a lot of the club coaches of other clubs are looking at some vacancies at international jobs that might come up for availability once the World Cup is done. But O'Gara doesn't really fall into either of those camps. Now, is he going to up sticks and leave Crusaders after one season? I'd be surprised.
Maybe.
Like, if he's down there to try and gain the experience of a different culture and a different way of doing things and arguably the best coaches in the world, does he want to leave that after a year?
Ideally, you'd have a full season or 2 full seasons, but opportunities like this might not necessarily come around.
Is the Connacht job an attractive one from a Ronan O'Gara point of view?
I think it is, and I'll tell you why. Because I think that the Munster job has a very young coach in situ at the moment, and the South Africa job has... so if you're Van Graan, you're like, well, my next job is going to be hopefully international rugby or one of the massive Super Rugby franchises. But actually, the Munster job is just as good as any of those Super Rugby franchises. So there's in place a coaching ticket in Munster that doesn't look like it's going to go anywhere for quite a while. The Ireland situation is going to be pretty interesting after the World Cup. David Nucifora is on the record as saying that only coaches within the Irish system are going to be considered for the Irish international coaching job, which means that there are 2 candidates for that, Stuart Lancaster and Andy Farrell at the moment. Like, if Ronan O'Gara wants to be part of that ticket at some point, come back, do Ireland, do Connacht all the way up until the World Cup, and then after that you could be part of the Ireland coaching ticket alongside a Lancaster or a Farrell. Like, you're a professional coach, you're thinking, you have to think 1 step / 2 steps ahead and go, well, how do I get myself into a situation where I get back into the Irish system at some point?
Well, I would say if that is what is in O'Gara's mind, we're speculating as to what might be in his mind, but then Connacht do not need Ronan O'Gara then. Connacht need a guy who's going to be able to come in, lay the foundation, lay out a roadmap of 3, 4, 5 years in duration, pretty much what Pat Lam did, convince them that your vision is the way to go. I think someone who's just coming in for a couple of years,
well, maybe it's
definitely
not
what Connacht need.
After Farrell / Lancaster get it.
So you're talking 4, 5, 6, 7 years from now. I think what the prospective new head coach for Connacht will have learned from this Kieran Keane situation is that you need to be more than just the head coach in Connacht. You have to be able to play the game off the field as well. There is a feeling out west that he didn't really interact with the support enough, didn't interact with the club game in the Connacht counties enough, and that would have been put in even more stark contrast when you compared it to the way Pat Lam behaved when he was over there, constantly referring to all the counties by name, constantly referring about how important it was to get into the schools, get into the clubs, talking to fans, meeting fans before and after games. I mean, he was the ideal head coach to try and get a province that had never really won anything to buy into everything together on and off the field. Kieran Keane just wanted to win matches as the head coach. He had no interest in anything else that went on. And I think this is down to far more than just results, because his first season is actually better than Pat Lam's first season was. And it's...
Well, Pat Lam was coming off a relatively low base. Kieran Keane's coming off a team that 2 seasons ago were the league champions. So it's not really fair. It's not like a
he inherited a team that had an absolutely awful season last season.
Everybody was injured. Everybody was injured.
The injury profile was a bit better this season.
Way better. And that's one of the things that they held against him, was like, well, hang on a second, you had all these really good players available. Like, that Connacht squad was way better than the one that Lam inherited. You had a bunch of players who just played for Ireland in the Chicago Test. Like, they had more players in that game than they've had playing for Ireland at the same time in ages. The Connacht job, I think, is a really good job.
But I think, though, it's a tough job. It kind of goes back to the Mickey Hart thing. It's a tough job to come in after Lam, purely for the reasons, as Dave has spoken about, which is not necessarily what you're doing on the field, but what you're doing off the field. Like Lam, this whole idea of culture, but Lam most definitely generated that. And for an outsider to generate that, and you could see by the people even around there and the supporters and the players, they really latched onto that, you know. So you had the Elwood factor, you had him coming in then, and you had all of that kind of feeling of, well, it's probably a bit of an underdog kind of, you know, it's us against them type thing. Now all of a sudden they're up there, and Keane is in a situation where he was saying, well, I want to put my stamp on the team. A year isn't enough to do it. I think it's pretty harsh on him, but obviously
so do I.
There's feeling down there that he isn't the man for the job, and maybe it's the player power thing again. The players have just said, no, we were very comfortable with this type of an individual who maybe massaged us, got us into that kind of right frame of mind, and yet we're being completely torn into this other extreme, which is maybe, as you say, results driven. We're going to try a different method. We're not necessarily going to really reach out to the supporters, etc., etc. We're just going to be very, very professional about it, and maybe they just weren't ready for that yet.
But the Connacht hierarchy can't have been surprised by that. Like, they did an awful lot of research into Kieran Keane. They knew exactly the type of coach and the type of personality they were bringing in. He was described as the perfect fit for this job when they recruited him.
They obviously didn't do enough research. Like, so it doesn't reflect well on them either that it turned out his character was a really bad fit for the job that they need.
Well, what I would say is, if we do the research on that and we get a guy like him in, well, then you better make sure he has a number 2 and a number 3 who are going to be out, going to the schools and visiting around and ticking the boxes with the players and making sure that the players feel okay and saying, listen, you know, he has the same desire as Lam has, but it's in a different way. Obviously, his backroom team, I don't necessarily know, but you would infer that there was obviously a disconnect there. Big time. Because after 12 months, it's just not long enough to put your stamp on anything.
It seems that way. And so he didn't pick the backroom team. You inherit the backroom team in these jobs. So Van Graan didn't pick his backroom team in Munster either, but like, it turns out that it seems like they're getting on well enough. At least when I think Van Graan can hire his own defensive coach, or they're like, so Nienaber came.
He has hired his own coach,
So there's at least one sidekick that you get. I don't know if Connacht do that, but
there was a difference in that Erasmus, obviously, we knew for months that Erasmus was on his way out, and he certainly laid the foundations for Van Graan to come in. There was a handover period. They managed that period of uncertainty as best they possibly could, where Kieran Keane didn't really have that. But one season is incredibly harsh on him now to be basically run out of the place. After a very disappointing campaign, but one in which they scored more tries, conceded fewer tries, beat Leinster, Munster and Ulster at home in the same season, which has not happened in my memory since the Celtic League and Pro 12, Pro 14, whatever guys you put on it, has come into being. So there were some positives, and I think at times you could certainly see that things were now starting to turn around for them, but he won't be the man given the opportunity to build on that.
I think it's amazing, again, it's that kind of stuff that you do off the pitch, and Lam was obviously brilliant at it. Like, I mean, I'd say if you were to ask most people on the street who's the current Connacht coach, they knew who Pat Lam was. You know, a lot of people would say, oh yeah, that guy, you know, because there was this mythical kind of nearly presence about him. But I think what Dave says about, well, what's actually right for Connacht is the thing. And that's why the O'Gara question. They have to actually sit down now and say, listen, what is right for us for the next 4 to 5 years? Because we need to. Very quickly they could find themselves that they just start to really go back down rather than being the force that they are. And they need to start adding the layers on. Is O'Gara then, like, I mean, most of what you were speaking about good for O'Gara, not necessarily good for Connacht.
Yeah,
you know.
I think he will be good for Connacht though, because he is that kind of messianic figure that people will immediately rally behind. There will be, like the world's media will pay attention to what
If he's in
Connacht
it for
do
the
for a
long
period
haul.
of time. Yeah, but
But they could also pay attention to it in a negative way. You know,
If it goes
things
badly.
and then what would that do? Rather than, I think the Lamb thing, Lamb wasn't that necessarily high profile, but he brought with it, as I say, so much else. And I still don't think they're at that kind of Leinster-Munster level where they need to, keep improving that and keep generating.
They absolutely do. Other potential candidates like Nigel Carlin has been part of that setup and is potentially ready to take that job, and so could easily get it. Pardon me. Bernard Jackman obviously has a difficult job on his hands in Wales and played out there, knows exactly what the scenario is, had a very impressive track record at Grenoble for a period of time. Is it time to get him back into the Irish system?
It's an interesting one. There would be some amongst the press corps in Newport that would like to see the back of Bernard. Again, I think almost like Kieran Keane, it would be harsh. He has to start from an incredibly low base at Sydney Parade, because it's not Sydney Parade, Rodney Parade, not the dart station, Rodney Parade.
I was saying, is he living out there? That's a long trek for him.
And he's had to rip it up at the seams and build again with Dragons. And I don't think he would want to leave after one season. But if a province you've played for, your first head coaching job within Ireland comes calling after the apprenticeship you've served in Grenoble and then in Newport, maybe that's too difficult to turn down. I don't know if he would be on the RFU and Connacht Rugby's radar. We keep having to remind ourselves that anything that Connacht want to do has to be rubber stamped by the RFU. So that's
somebody suggesting Jerry Flannery on the tweets, obviously another former Connacht player, clearly doing brilliantly at the moment with Munster, and you can see him embedded in Munster's culture, and why the hell would he leave when they're at European Champions Cup semi-final level. But equally the opportunity to be the number one is very appealing to people.
I think the culture thing, though, is a big thing, and I think the former Connacht thing has to resonate. I think even with the O'Gara thing or like a Flannery thing, Connacht have done so much work over the last 7 to 8, say 10 years to try and make themselves an entity within the four, and they're trying to bring everything around that this is Connacht. It's about Leitrim and this kind of idea. That if you bring in someone who's steeped in Munster history or Leinster history, and is seen as a Leinster or Munster person, well then I think that actually drags away from it.
You dilute it a little.
I think it does. Now, not massively in the professional era, but I think it just does enough. And you don't need that. They don't need that. They need everything kind of nearly playing on for themselves, that are adding things rather than taking away. So is the Jackman thing? Potentially.
Two back-to-back there about, the first one was from Digger talking about how it's a shoe in the hole for the Irish lads, that it's going to be another assistant coach from the Southern Hemisphere who no one's heard of. I mean, it worked out when no one had really heard of Joe Schmidt. It worked out when no one had really heard of Michael Cheika. So there is definitely value to be had in shopping globally. Like, we only put the Irish options up this morning just to show that there are Irish options there. We haven't even mentioned Eddie O'Sullivan yet. You have to feel like the ship has sailed in terms of Eddie's relationship with the IRFU. And actually, he's a brilliant rugby pundit, and the game would not necessarily be better for having lost his voice in the media, but equally you can see how it would appeal to him.
Yeah, even if it's not necessarily Eddie being a head coach, whether there's a director of rugby role there maybe, or something a little more statesman-like, where Eddie can be there in a consultancy capacity, he can oversee things, and you bring in a younger head coach to work underneath him. One other question I'd have about the Connacht situation is, did John Muldoon know that Kieran Keane was going to be handed his P45 when he decided that upon retirement he was going to go into coaching?
Did Dan McFarlane know? Like, is the Ulster job better than the Connacht job?
I would think so.
Why?
Resources, better stadium, bigger fan base, better pedigree.
And not a very...
Better weather.
Like, is it better?
Probably not, marginally maybe.
I don't know.
All I know is every time I go by Ballinasloe, it starts to rain.
I mean, this is true, right?
It was an opportunity for Muldoon to be that Connacht link. So if it was an O'Gara, for example, as we've been discussing, well, you've John Muldoon as your defence coach, for example. And I'm sure John Muldoon would love to have been part of the coaching setup at Connacht, but maybe not necessarily under Kieran Keane.
They can always ring him and say, here, listen, this opportunity has arisen. What do you think?
He's on the Pat Lam. He's hitched his wagon to Pat Lam now. I don't think he's going to be changing his mind on that one anytime soon, to be able to coach in the Premiership. I'm just saying,
actually, it's the right thing to do probably
Absolutely,
for him in terms of get out, understand exactly what the Premiership is like, and then come back in a couple of years' time to be the successor to Ronan O'Gara. It all, like, you can start building these things.
No, it You've been thinking a lot about this year, but it actually is the right thing for him. I know we don't want to go on about him, but he has to experience something else because he's been there so long.
Yeah.
All he's ever seen is
But it's what O'Gara did, and it's worked out really well for him to get out of there as well. So.